Stay away.
You were a witch. Fucking witch.
Can hear his smile.
I am become death. Tales Under a Broken Sky, Episode 31, Carmilla, by Joseph Sheridan, Fanu, Part 5. 11. The Story. With all my heart, said the General, with an effort, and after a short pause, in which to arrange his subject, he commenced one of the strangest narratives I ever heard. My dear child was looking forward with great pleasure to the visit you had been so good as to arrange for her to your charming daughter. Here he made me a gallant but melancholy bow. In the meantime, we had an invitation to my old friend, the Count Carlsfield, whose schloss is about 6 leagues to the other side of Karnstein. It was to attend a series of fetes, which, you remember, were given by him in honour of his illustrious visitor, the Grand Duke Charles. Yes, and very splendid I believe they were, said my father. Princely, but then his hospitalities are quite regal. He has Aladdin's lamp. The night from which my sorrow dates was devoted to a magnificent masquerade. The grounds were thrown open, the trees hung with coloured lamps. There was such a display of fireworks as Paris itself had never witnessed, and such music. Music, you know, is my weakness. Such ravishing music. The finest instrumental band, perhaps in the world, and the finest singers who could be collected from all the great operas in Europe. As you wandered through these fantastically illuminated grounds, the moonlighted chateau throwing a rosy light from its long rows of windows, you would suddenly hear these ravishing voices stealing from the silence of some grove, or rising from boats upon the lake. I felt myself, as I looked and listened, carried back into the romance and poetry of my early youth. When the fireworks were ended, and the ball beginning, we returned to the noble suite of rooms that were thrown open to the dancers. A mass ball, you know, is a beautiful sight, but so brilliant a spectacle of the kind I never saw before. It was a very aristocratic assembly. I was myself almost the only nobody present. My dear child was looking quite beautiful. She wore no mask. Her excitement and delight added an unspeakable charm to her features, always lovely. I remarked a young lady, dressed magnificently, but wearing a mask, who appeared to me to be observing my ward with extraordinary interest. I had seen her, earlier in the evening, in the great hall, and again for a few minutes, walking near us, on the terrace under the castle windows, similarly employed. A lady, also masked, richly and gravely dressed, and with a stately air, like a person of rank, accompanied her as a chaperone. Had the young lady not worn a mask, I could, of course, have been much more certain upon the question whether she was really watching my poor darling. I am now well assured that she was. We were now in one of the salons. My poor dear child had been dancing, and was resting a little in one of the chairs near the door. I was standing near. The 2 ladies I have mentioned had approached, and the younger took the chair next to my ward, while her companion stood beside me, and for a little time addressed herself, in a low tone, to her charge. Availing herself of the privilege of her mask, she turned to me, and in the tone of an old friend, and calling me by my name, opened the conversation with me, which piqued my curiosity a good deal. She referred to many scenes where she had met me, at court and at distinguished houses. She alluded to little incidents which I had long ceased to think of, but which, I found, had only lain in abeyance in my memory, for they instantly started into life at her touch. I became more and more curious to ascertain who she was, every moment. She parried my attempts to discover very adroitly and pleasantly. The knowledge she showed of many passages in my life seemed to me all but unaccountable, and she appeared to take a not unnatural pleasure in foiling my curiosity, and in seeing me flounder, in my eager perplexity, from one conjecture to the other. In the meantime, the young lady, whom her mother called by the odd name of Millarca, when she was once or twice addressed her, had, with the same ease and grace, got into conversation with my ward. She introduced herself by saying that her mother was a very old acquaintance of mine. She spoke of the agreeable audacity which a mask rendered practicable. She talked like a friend, she admired her dress, and insinuated very prettily her admiration of her beauty. She amused her with laughing criticisms upon the people who crowded the ballroom, and laughed at my poor child's fun. She was very witty and lively when she pleased, and after a time they had grown very good friends, and the young stranger lowered her mask, displaying a remarkably beautiful face. I had never seen it before, neither had my dear child, but though it was new to us, the features were so engaging, as well as lovely, that it was impossible not to feel the attraction powerfully. My poor girl did so. I never saw anyone more taken with another at first sight, unless, indeed, it was the stranger herself, who seemed quite to have lost her heart to her. In the meantime, availing myself of the license of a masquerade, I put not a few questions to the elder lady. "You have puzzled me utterly," I said, laughing. "Is that not enough? Won't you now consent to stand on equal terms, and do me the kindness to remove your mask?" "Can any request be more unreasonable?" she replied. "Ask a lady to yield an advantage. Beside, how do you know you should recognize me? Years make changes." "As you see," I said, with a bow, and, I suppose, a rather melancholy little laugh. "As philosophers tell us," she said. "And how do you know that a sight of my face would help you?" "I should take chance for that," I answered. "It is vain trying to make yourself out an old woman. Your figure betrays you." "Years, nevertheless, have passed since I saw you. Rather, since you saw me, for that is what I am considering. Millarca there is my daughter. I cannot then be young, even in the opinion of people whom time has taught to be indulgent, and I may not like to be compared with what you remember me. You have no mask to remove. You can offer nothing in exchange. My petition is to your pity to remove it, and mine to yours to let it stay where it is," she replied. "Well then, at least you will tell me whether you are French or German. You speak both languages so perfectly." "I don't think I shall tell you that, General. You intend a surprise, and are meditating the particular point of attack. At all events, you won't deny this," I said, "that being honoured by your permission to converse, I ought to know how to address you. Shall I say Madame la Comtesse?" She laughed, and she would, no doubt, have met me with another evasion, if indeed I can treat any occurrence in an interview, every circumstance of which was prearranged, as I now believe, with the profoundest cunning, as liable to be modified by accident. "As to that," she began, but she was interrupted, almost as she opened her lips, by a gentleman, dressed in black, who looked particularly elegant and distinguished, with this drawback that his face was the most deadly pale I ever saw, except in death. He was in no masquerade, in the plain evening dress of a gentleman, and he said, without a smile, but with a courtly and unusually low bow, "Will Madame la Comtesse permit me to say a very few words which may interest her?" The lady turned quickly to him, and touched her lip in token of silence. She then said to me, "Keep my place for me, General. I shall return when I have said a few words." And with this injunction, playfully given, she walked a little aside with the gentleman in black, and talked for some minutes, apparently very earnestly. They then walked away slowly together in the crowd, and I lost them for some minutes. I spent the interval in cudgelling my brains for conjecture as to the identity of the lady who seemed to remember me so kindly, and I was thinking of turning about and joining in the conversation between my pretty ward and the Countess's daughter, and trying whether, by the time she returned, I might not have a surprise in store for her, by having her name, title, chateau, and estates at my fingers' ends. But at this moment she returned, accompanied by the pale man in black, who said, "I shall return and inform Madame la Comtesse when her carriage is at the door." He withdrew with a bow. 12. A petition. "Then, we are to lose Madame la Comtesse, but I hope only for a few hours," I said, with a low bow. "It may be that only, or it may be a few weeks. It was very unlucky his speaking to me just now as he did. Do you now know me?" I assured her I did not. "You shall know me," she said, "but not at present. We are older and better friends than perhaps you suspect. I cannot yet declare myself. I shall in 3 weeks pass your beautiful schloss, about which I have been making inquiries. I shall then look in upon you for an hour or two, and renew a friendship which I never think of without 1,000 pleasant recollections. This moment, a piece of news has reached me like a thunderbolt. I must set out now, and travel by a devious route, nearly 100 miles, with all the dispatch I can possibly make. My perplexities multiply. I am only deterred by the compulsory reserve I practice as to my name from making a very singular request of you. My poor child has not quite recovered her strength. Her horse fell with her at a hunt which she had ridden out to witness. Her nerves have not yet recovered the shock, and our physician says that she must on no account exert herself for some time to come. We came here, in consequence, by very easy stages, hardly 6 leagues a day. I must now travel day and night on a mission of life and death, a mission the critical and momentous nature of which I shall be able to explain to you when we meet, as I hope we shall, in a few weeks, without the necessity of any concealment. She went on to make her petition, and it was in the tone of a person from whom such a request amounted to conferring, rather than seeking a favour. This was only in manner, and, as it seemed, quite unconsciously. Then, the terms in which it was expressed, nothing could be more deprecatory. It was simply that I would consent to take charge of her daughter during her absence. This was, all things considered, a strange, not to say an audacious request. She, in some sort, disarmed me by stating and admitting everything that could be urged against it, and throwing herself entirely upon my chivalry. At the same moment, by a fatality that seems to have predetermined all that happened, my poor child came to my side, and, in an undertone, besought me to invite her new friend, Millarca, to pay us a visit. She had just been sounding her, and thought, if her mamma would allow it, she would like it extremely. At another time, I should have told her to wait a little, until at least we knew who they were. But I had not a moment to think in. The two ladies assailed me together, and I must confess the refined and beautiful face of the young lady, about which there was something extremely engaging, as well as the elegance and fire of high birth, determined me, and quite overpowered, I submitted and undertook too easily the care of the young lady, whom her mother called Millarca. The Countess beckoned to her daughter, who listened with grave attention while she told her, in general terms, how suddenly and peremptorily she had been summoned, and also of the arrangement she had made for her under my care, adding that I was one of her earliest and most valuable friends. I made, of course, such speeches as the case seemed to call for, and found myself, on reflection, in a position which I did not half like. The gentleman in black returned, and very ceremoniously conducted the lady from the room. The demeanour of this gentleman was such as to impress me with the conviction that the Countess was a lady of very much more importance than her modest title alone might have led me to assume. Her last charge to me was that no attempt was to be made to learn more about her than I might have already guessed until her return. Our distinguished host, whose guest she was, knew her reasons. But here, she said, neither I nor my daughter could safely remain for more than a day. I removed my mask imprudently for a moment, about an hour ago, and too late. I fancied you saw me. So I resolved to seek an opportunity of talking a little to you. Had I found that you had seen me, I would have thrown myself on your high sense of honour to keep my secret some weeks. As it is, I am satisfied that you did not see me. But if you now suspect, or, on reflection, should suspect who I am, I commit myself, in like manner, entirely to your honour. My daughter will observe the same secrecy, and I well know that you will, from time to time, remind her, lest she should thoughtlessly disclose it. She whispered a few words to her daughter, kissed her hurriedly twice, and went away, accompanied by the pale gentleman in black, and disappeared in the crowd. In the next room, said Millarca, there is a window that looks upon the hall door. I should like to see the last of Mamma, and to kiss my hand to her. We assented, of course, and accompanied her to the window. We looked out, and saw a handsome old-fashioned carriage, with a troop of couriers and footmen. We saw the slim figure of the pale gentleman in black, as he held a thick velvet cloak, and placed it about her shoulders, and threw the hood over her head. She nodded to him, and just touched his hand with hers. He bowed low repeatedly as the door closed, and the carriage began to move. She is gone, said Millarca, with a sigh. She is gone, I repeated to myself, for the first time, in the hurried moments that had elapsed since my consent reflecting upon the folly of my act. She did not look up, said the young lady plaintively. The Countess had taken off her mask, perhaps, and did not care to show her face, I said, and she could not know that you were in the window. She sighed and looked in my face. She was so beautiful that I relented. I was sorry that I had for a moment repented of my hospitality, and I determined to make her amends for the unavowed churlishness of my reception. The young lady, replacing her mask, joined my ward in persuading me to return to the grounds where the concert was soon to be renewed. We did so, and walked up and down the terrace that lies under the castle windows. Millarca became very intimate with us, and amused us with lively descriptions and stories of most of the great people whom we saw upon the terrace. I liked her more and more every minute. Her gossip, without being ill-natured, was extremely diverting to me, who had been so long out of the great world. I thought what life she would give to our sometimes lonely evenings at home. The ball was not over until the morning sun had almost reached the horizon. It pleased the Grand Duke to dance till then, so loyal people could not go away or think of bed. We had just got through a crowded saloon when my ward asked me what had become of Millarca. I thought she had been by her side, and she fancied she was by mine. The fact was, we had lost her. All my efforts to find her were vain. I feared that she had mistaken, in the confusion of a momentary separation from us, other people for her new friends, and had possibly pursued and lost them in the extensive grounds which were thrown open to us. Now, in its full force, I recognized a new folly in my having undertaken the charge of a young lady without so much as knowing her name, and fettered as I was by promises of the reasons for imposing which I knew nothing. I could not even point my inquiries by saying that the missing young lady was the daughter of the Countess who had taken her departure a few hours before. Morning broke. It was clear daylight before I gave up my search. It was not till near 2 o'clock next day that we heard anything of my missing charge. At about that time, a servant knocked at my niece's door to say that he had been earnestly requested by a young lady who appeared to be in great distress to make out where she could find the General Baron Spielsdorf and the young lady, his daughter, in whose charge she had been left by her mother. There could be no doubt, notwithstanding the slight inaccuracy, that our young friend had turned up, and so she had. Would to heaven we had lost her. She told my poor child a story to account for her having failed to recover us for so long. Very late, she said, she had got to the housekeeper's bedroom in despair of finding us, and had then fallen into a deep sleep, which, long as it was, had hardly sufficed to recruit her strength after the fatigues of the ball. That day, Millarca came home with us. I was only too happy, after all, to have secured so charming a companion for my dear girl. 13. The Woodman. There soon, however, appeared some drawbacks. In the first place, Millarca complained of extreme languor, the weakness that remained after her late illness, and she had never emerged from her room till the afternoon was pretty far advanced. In the next place, it was accidentally discovered, although she always locked her door on the inside, and never disturbed the key from its place till she admitted the maid to assist at her toilet, that she was undoubtedly sometimes absent from her room in the very early morning, and at various times later in the day, before she wished it to be understood that she was stirring. She was repeatedly seen from the windows of the schloss in the first faint grey of the morning, walking through the trees in an easterly direction and looking like a person in a trance. This convinced me that she walked in her sleep, but this hypothesis did not solve the puzzle. How did she pass out from her room, leaving the door locked on the inside? How did she escape from the house without unbarring door or window? In the midst of my perplexities, an anxiety of a far more urgent kind presented itself. My dear child began to lose her looks and health, and that in a manner so mysterious and even horrible that I became thoroughly frightened. She was at first visited by appalling dreams, then, as she fancied, by a spectre, sometimes resembling Millarca, sometimes in the shape of a beast indistinctly seen, walking around the foot of her bed from side to side. Lastly came sensations. One, not unpleasant, but very peculiar, she said, resembled the flow of an icy stream against her breast. At a later time, she felt something like a pair of large needles pierce her, a little below the throat, with a very sharp pain. A few nights after, followed a gradual and convulsive sense of strangulation. Then came unconsciousness. I could hear distinctly every word the kind old general was saying, because by this time we were driving upon the short grass that spreads on either side of the road as you approached a roofless village which had not shown the smoke of a chimney for more than half a century. You may guess how strangely I felt as I heard my own symptoms so exactly described in those which had been experienced by that poor girl, who, but for the catastrophe which followed, would have been at that moment a visitor at my father's chateau. You may suppose also how I felt as I heard him detail habits and mysterious peculiarities which were in fact those of our beautiful guest, Carmilla. A vista opened in the forest. We were on a sudden under the chimneys and gables of the ruined village, and the towers and battlements of the dismantled castle, round which gigantic trees are grouped, overhung us from a slight eminence. In a frightened dream, I got down from the carriage, and in silence, for which we had an abundant matter for thinking, we soon mounted the ascent, and were among the spacious chambers, winding stairs, and dark corridors of the castle. And this was once the palatial residence of the Karnsteins, said the old general at length, as from a great window he looked out across the village, and saw the wide, undulating expanse of forest. It was a bad family, and here its blood-stained annals were written, he continued. It is hard that they should, after death, continue to plague the human race with their atrocious lusts. That is the chapel of the Karnsteins, down there. He pointed down to the grey walls of the Gothic building, partly visible through the foliage, a little way down the steep. And I hear the axe of a woodman, he added, busy among the trees that surround it. He possibly may give us the information of which I am in search, and point out the grave of Mircalla, Countess of Karnstein. These rustics preserve the local traditions of great families, whose stories die out among the rich and titled so soon as the families themselves become extinct. We have a portrait at home of Mircalla, the Countess Karnstein. Should you like to see it? Asked my father. Time enough, dear friend, replied the general. I believe that I have seen the original, and one motive which has led me to you earlier than I at first intended was to explore the chapel which we are now approaching. What? See the Countess Mircalla? Exclaimed my father. Why, she has been dead more than a century. Not so dead as you fancy, I am told, answered the general. I confess, general, you puzzle me utterly, replied my father. Looking at him, I fancied for a moment, with a return of the suspicion I detected before. But although there was anger and detestation at times in the old general's manner, there was nothing flighty. There remains to me, he said, as we passed under the heavy arch of the Gothic church, for its dimensions would have justified its being so styled, but one object which can interest me during the few years that remain to me on earth, and that is to wreak on her the vengeance which, I thank God, may still be accomplished by a mortal arm. What vengeance can you mean? Asked my father, in increasing amazement. I mean to decapitate the monster, he answered, with a fierce flush, and a stamp that echoed mournfully through the hollow room, and his clenched hand was at the same moment raised, as if it grasped the handle of an axe, while he shook it ferociously in the air. What? Exclaimed my father, more than ever bewildered. To strike her head off? Cut her head off? Aye, with a hatchet, with a spade, or with anything that can cleave through her murderous throat. You shall hear, he answered, trembling with rage, and hurrying forward, he said, that beam will answer for a seat. Your dear child is fatigued. Let her be seated, and I will in a few sentences close my dreadful story. The squared block of wood, which lay on the grass-grown pavement of the chapel, formed the bench on which I was very glad to seat myself, and in the meantime the general called to the woodman, who had been removing some boughs which leaned upon the old walls, and axe in hand, the hardy old fellow stood before us. He could not tell us anything of these monuments, but there was an old man, he said, a ranger of this forest, at present sojourning in the house of the priest about 2 miles away, who could point out every monument of the old Karnstein family, and for a trifle he undertook to bring him back with him, if we would lend him one of our horses in little more than half an hour. Have you been long employed about this forest? Asked my father of the old man. I have been a woodman here, he answered in his patois, under the forester all my days. So has my father before me, and so on, as many generations as I can count up. I could show you the very house in the village here, in which my ancestors lived. How came the village to be deserted? Asked the general. It was troubled by revenants, sir. Several were tracked to their graves. They are detected by the usual tests, and extinguished in the usual way, by decapitation, by the stake, and by burning. But not until many of the villagers were killed. But after all these proceedings according to law, he continued, so many graves opened and so many vampires deprived of their horrible animation, the village was not relieved. But a Moravian nobleman, who happened to be travelling this way, heard how matters were, and being skilled, as many people are in his country, in such affairs, he offered to deliver the village from its tormentor. He did so thus. There being a bright moon that night, he ascended, shortly after sunset, the towers of the chapel here, from whence he could distinctly see the churchyard beneath him. You can see it from that window. From this point, he watched until he saw the vampire come out of his grave and place near it the linen clothes in which he had been folded, and then glide away towards the village to plague its inhabitants. The stranger, having seen all this, came down from the steeple, took the linen wrappings of the vampire, and carried them up to the top of the tower, which he again mounted. When the vampire returned from his prowlings and missed his clothes, he cried furiously to the Moravian, whom he saw at the summit of the tower, and who, in reply, beckoned him to ascend and take them. Whereupon the vampire, accepting his invitation, began to climb the steeple, and so soon as he had reached the battlements, the Moravian, with a stroke of his sword, clove his skull in twain, hurling him down to the churchyard, whither, descending by the winding stairs, the stranger followed and cut his head off, and the next day delivered it and the body to the villagers, who duly impaled and burnt them. This Moravian nobleman had authority from the then head of the family to remove the tomb of Mercala, Countess Karnstein, which he did effectually, so that in a little while its site was quite forgotten. Can you point out where it stood? Asked the general eagerly. The forester shook his head and smiled. Not a soul living could tell you that now, he said. Besides, they say her body was removed, but no one is sure of that either. Having thus spoken, as time pressed, he dropped his axe and departed, leaving us to hear the remainder of the general's strange story. Welcome, folks, to episode 31 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I'm your host, Keith, and I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. This week, we begin to draw near to the climax of Fanu's novella. General Spielsdorf begins to relate the story of his niece's death, the aftermath, and his subsequent travels. As the party listen to the story, Laura begins to wonder at the similarities between the mysterious sickness that plagued the general's charge, as well as the many familiar traits shared between General Spielsdorf's visitor and Carmilla. For the reader, who is already suspicious, if not in the know about the true nature of Carmilla and her mysterious activities, the truth begins to emerge here, as it is clear there is a shared modus operandi between the case of the general's niece and the events that led Carmilla to stay with Laura and her father. The story is now reaching the endgame, and we learn of the fate of the Karnsteins and the village that lay below their castle, and it is becoming clear that similar events are now occurring in the region once again. With only 3 chapters left in the story, all of the pieces are now in place for the climax, which has been so wonderfully crafted and paced. All of the information has been fed to the reader in a measured and patient manner, and the world within the novella has been painted in great detail, despite the short length of the novella itself. To a modern audience, familiar with Dracula and subsequent retelling spin-offs and vampire stories, this is probably more evident than it was back when the story was first released, but the manner in which the story has progressed from beginning to the increasingly tense end is masterful. Fanu brings along the reader with the steady unfolding of events, and the casual manner in which Laura's story is related draws in the reader on a personal level, in a similar vein to the manner in which Bram Stoker drew in the reader in Dracula through the use of journals and newspaper clippings, or in a more modern context, the way in which found footage horror is immersive. Next week will be the final installment in the reading of this magnificent work of Gothic horror, after which we will resume the usual 2-week release cadence for the podcast. I've enjoyed this little diversion immensely, although I'm also looking forward to getting back on track with some original content I've been working on for the past few months. Join us once again by the hearth next week for the final installment of Carmilla. Until next time. Thank you for listening to episode 31 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I hope you enjoyed this week's production as much as I enjoyed reading and recording it. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing to the podcast on your platform of choice and sharing with your friends. This will really help the show and keep me motivated to produce more content. Thank you again for your time.